The aroma of burnt onions and overcooked rice filled the small kitchen, but Emily barely noticed. Her heart raced as the clock ticked closer to the dinner hour. Tonight, she wasn't just cooking for a few guests. She was preparing a meal that could either change everything or destroy the one thing she had left, her dignity. Her mind flashed back to the cruel words that had echoed through her head all week. "You, a chef, don't make me laugh." She had heard them from her colleagues, her friends, even from strangers who looked down on her with disdain when they learned of her humble beginnings. Emily had worked as a waitress at the same upscale restaurant. For 3 years, the job had never been glamorous, but it had paid the bills. Most of her colleagues were kind, but some were dismissive, condescending, especially when they found out she hadn't attended culinary school or come from a prestigious background. They didn't know her story, nor did they care. To them, she was just another nobody, working hard to make ends meet. She had spent her life in the shadow of others' expectations, constantly fighting to prove her worth. It wasn't that she hadn't tried to break free from the mold. It was just that the world always seemed to have a way of putting her back in her place. That is, until tonight. Emily had always loved food. The rhythm of the kitchen, the smell of fresh herbs, the sizzle of a pan. It was the only place she truly felt alive. But she had never been able to afford a proper culinary education. So she learned by watching others, experimenting on her own, and studying cookbooks in her free time. Her passion for cooking was something that set her apart from the other waitstaff, but she had kept it a secret, hidden deep within her soul. She had never expected her chance to come like this. A one-night opportunity to cook for the city's most influential billionaires. It had all started with a casual conversation during her shift at the restaurant. Mr. Phillips, a regular customer who owned several high-end businesses in the area, had been sitting at the bar one night, sipping on a glass of wine. "You've been here for quite a while now, Emily. You've got the patience of a saint," he had said with a grin. Emily had smiled politely. "It's a job, sir, just doing my best. You know, you'd make a fantastic chef if you ever decided to pursue it. You've got a knack for picking up on the little details, the way you carry yourself, the way you manage the chaos of the restaurant. There's something about you." Emily had laughed, but inside, her heart had skipped a beat. She had always dreamed of being a chef, but it seemed like an impossible dream. The conversation had turned into an invitation for a private dinner party, a gathering of powerful people who could afford anything they desired. Mr. Phillips had casually mentioned he'd been looking for someone to prepare an exclusive dinner for a few close friends, wealthy businessmen who would be willing to invest in something new. He had looked at her with an oddly intense expression. "How about it? What have you got to lose?" For a moment, Emily had hesitated. Could she really do it? Could she cook for people who had everything, people who could make or break her future? With just one bite? She was just a waitress. What did she know about impressing the ultra-wealthy? But then she remembered the old cookbooks she had pored over for years, the dishes she had perfected in her tiny apartment, the dream that had kept her going through all the struggles. She could do this. She had to. So she agreed. Now, standing in her cramped kitchen, sweat dripping from her brow as the clock continued to tick closer to the dinner hour, Emily was beginning to second-guess herself. Was she really ready for this? Was it too late to back out? The weight of it all felt unbearable. There was no turning back now. If she failed, she'd be nothing more than the punchline to another cruel joke. The ridicule she had endured for years, the whispers behind her back about her lack of qualifications, would come back to haunt her. This dinner, this night, was her chance to prove herself. Not just to them, but to herself. The dish she had decided to prepare was simple, yet sophisticated. a delicate lobster bisque, followed by a perfectly seared steak with roasted vegetables, and finally, a dessert that had been passed down through her family, a vanilla bean panna cotta with fresh berries. It was a menu she had spent days perfecting, each dish carefully chosen for its balance of flavors, textures, and elegance. But nothing had gone as planned. The lobster bisque had simmered too long, and the vegetables had started to overcook. She was running out of time, and her nerves were starting to get the better of her. Every clink of the utensils, every sizzle from the stove, every moment that passed felt like an eternity. No, I can do this, she thought, her hands trembling slightly as she wiped them on her apron. I've worked too hard for this. I'm not going to let fear get in the way. Just as she was finishing the last touch on the steak, her phone buzzed. A message from Mr. Phillips. We'll be there in 30 minutes. Don't disappoint us. The words hung in the air, a weight that seemed to press against her chest. She quickly set the phone down, trying to ignore the growing anxiety in her stomach. She had a job to do, and she couldn't let anyone down, least of all herself. She plated the first course, the lobster bisque, and carefully arranged it with a swirl of cream and a sprinkling of chives. She then moved to the second course, the steak, and seared it to perfection, the aroma filling the kitchen. The vegetables were roasted, golden and tender. Finally, she set to work on the panna cotta, its creamy texture now a work of art on the plate. When she finished, she took a deep breath. The dinner was ready. Now all she had to do was wait. The doorbell rang and her heart leapt into her throat. She quickly wiped her hands on her apron and opened the door to reveal Mr. Phillips and his guests, 5 of the wealthiest, most influential people in the city. They were everything she had imagined, perfectly dressed, exuding confidence and power, their faces unreadable as they walked into her small apartment. Emily's nerves were on edge as she led them to the dining table, where the meal awaited. The first bite was met with silence, a few hesitant chews. And then the unthinkable happened. One of the billionaires, a man with a sharp jaw and even sharper eyes, dropped his fork onto the plate. His gaze locked onto Emily's with a mix of shock and disbelief. "What is this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The other guests froze, waiting for his verdict. Emily felt the weight of their gazes on her. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat, and her hands were shaking. It felt like the world was closing in on her. The billionaire, who had been sitting at the head of the table, slowly stood. His eyes never left hers. This is beyond anything I've ever tasted." His voice was low but forceful, his words carrying a weight that sent a shiver down Emily's spine. The room erupted in murmurs, and Emily could feel her breath coming in shallow gasps. "I need to know how you made this," he continued, his gaze still locked on her. The others around the table exchanged surprised glances. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected her to be the one to impress them. Her heart raced in her chest as she took a step forward, trying to compose herself. "It's just a recipe I've perfected over the years," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's nothing special." But they weren't listening to her words. They were watching her, looking at her as though she had just done the impossible. The evening had unfolded like a dream. Emily had never imagined herself in such a setting, standing before 5 billionaires, a room full of people who could buy anything they wanted with the snap of their fingers. Yet they were now sitting in stunned silence after tasting a dish she had made with nothing more than her own instincts and a deep passion for cooking. But now, as the last of the guests left her small apartment, Emily felt a strange emptiness creep in. The applause, the compliments, the surprised expressions, all of it seemed distant now, as if she had stepped into someone else's life. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. She closed the door softly behind her guests, her heart still racing. They had left with promises of future collaboration and meetings, but the weight of their words felt unreal. She had expected the evening to be a one-off, an experiment. She hadn't expected to leave the night with invitations to exclusive events, business cards exchanged with some of the wealthiest people in the city, and their praises ringing in her ears. And yet, as she looked around her modest apartment, everything seemed unchanged. The same chipped countertops, the same worn-out chairs that had seen better days. Nothing had changed in her world, except her confidence, her belief in herself that had been shaken to its core. Emily sank into the couch, her legs weak beneath her. She ran a hand through her disheveled hair, a nervous laugh escaping her lips. Did I really just do that? The events of the night replayed in her mind like a loop, each moment more surreal than the last. When the billionaire had asked her how she made the dish, Emily had simply shrugged it off, brushing aside their compliments with modest words. But inside, she felt a storm brewing, a strange mixture of excitement and fear, disbelief and hope. She had crossed a line that night. She had stepped into a world she had only ever dreamed of, and now it was impossible to ignore the tug of something greater than herself. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, and she snapped out of her daze. She picked it up and her eyes widened as she saw the message. Mr. Phillips, I've arranged a meeting with some of the people from tonight's dinner. They want to talk about potential projects. Let's meet tomorrow at my office. Her breath caught in her throat. A meeting? With them? Emily couldn't believe it. She had only been expecting a few thank yous and empty promises. But now it was happening. The opportunity of a lifetime had just landed at her doorstep. But what was she really getting into? The whole evening had felt like a blur, a whirlwind of food, compliments, and power. These were people who could change her life, for better or for worse. They were businessmen, investors, and high society figures who thrived on the kind of power that Emily had always seen from the sidelines. They lived in a world where money and influence ruled everything. But where did she fit in? She had spent years working in a restaurant, never believing she could actually be a chef, let alone a person worth investing in. Cooking had always been a form of escape for her, a way to express herself without worrying about the judgments of others. It had never been a career choice. It was just something she loved to do. Yet now, she was being thrust into the very thing. She had spent her entire life running away from expectations. The weight of it all pressed down on her, and she felt a familiar pang of doubt. Am I really ready for this? The next morning, Emily woke up early, her mind spinning with thoughts of the meeting. She dressed quickly, putting on the only suit she owned. Nothing extravagant, just a simple black blazer and a white blouse. It was the best she could manage with the little she had. She ran her fingers through her hair, trying to tame it, but it fell back into its natural waves, unruly and untamed. She didn't care. This wasn't the time for perfection. She took the bus to Mr. Phillips' office, her stomach tight with nerves. The city was alive with its usual bustle, but for Emily, everything felt distant. The tall skyscrapers around her seemed to loom over her, and every person she passed seemed to have somewhere important to be, somewhere they belonged. And then there was Emily, just another face in the crowd, with nothing but a dream and a plate of food that had somehow changed the course of her life. When she arrived at the office building, she was struck by its grandeur. The lobby was polished and sleek, with marble floors and walls that seemed to gleam under the bright lights. A receptionist greeted her with a warm smile, but a professional distance, directing her to the elevator that would take her up to the meeting room. Emily felt a bead of sweat trickle down her spine as the elevator doors closed, the hum of the machinery echoing in the silence. She gripped her purse tightly, trying to steady her breathing. This is it. This is where everything changes. The elevator dinged, and the doors slid open to reveal a sleek conference room. A long table sat in the center, surrounded by chairs occupied by several people, each one a figure of authority. At the head of the table was Mr. Phillips, looking every bit the part of a businessman in his tailored suit, his eyes sharp and calculating as he looked up from a stack of papers. "Ah, Emily," he said with a smile, standing up to greet her. "I'm glad you could make it." She returned the smile, though it felt more like a nervous reflex than anything else. "Thank you for the invitation," she replied, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. The other men and women at the table eyed her with a mixture of curiosity and interest. They were older, more seasoned, their faces hard and expressionless. Emily could almost feel their judgment, as if they were dissecting her every move. Mr. Phillips gestured for her to take a seat, and she did, her legs trembling slightly as she tried to sit up straight. She could feel their eyes on her, the weight of their expectations pressing down on her. One of the men, a tall, sharply dressed investor named Mr. Turner, cleared his throat. "So, Emily, we've all heard about your talent last night," he said, his voice smooth but laced with skepticism. "But talent alone doesn't make someone successful. It takes more than that. Why should we believe that you can actually deliver on a larger scale? That's what we're all wondering." Emily swallowed, her heart pounding in her chest. This wasn't the same as cooking in her small apartment, surrounded by familiar faces. These people were not here for niceties. They were here to make decisions that could change her life, and they weren't going to do it based on a whim. She took a deep breath. "I know I don't have the formal education or the experience that most of you are used to seeing, but what I do have is passion and a genuine love for cooking. I've spent my whole life perfecting my craft, and I'm willing to work harder than anyone else to prove that I can make this work." The room was silent as she spoke, and for a moment it felt like time had stopped. She could hear the sound of her own heartbeat, each beat louder than the last. Finally, Mr. Phillips spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "You've got our attention, Emily. Now the question is, what are you going to do with it?" The meeting had left Emily feeling both exhilarated and overwhelmed, like a tightrope walker balancing between the exhilarating heights of success and the crushing depths of failure. She had stepped into a world she had once only dared to dream about. But now she was here, standing on the precipice of something much larger than she had ever imagined. The questions, the scrutiny, the pressure, Emily felt them all pressing against her chest, demanding answers she didn't yet have. Mr. Phillips had been intrigued, but the others, they were more difficult to read. Some had been politely interested, asking pointed questions about her methods and her vision for the future. But the questions from Mr. Turner, the investor with the sharp suit and sharper gaze, had unsettled her. His skepticism was almost palpable, and Emily couldn't help but wonder what it was that they really wanted from her. The meeting had ended with an offer, a partnership, but one that came with terms she hadn't fully grasped yet. It was clear that Mr. Phillips saw potential in her, but the others, they were still calculating the risk. The price of entry to their world wasn't just talent or hard work. It was something much more intangible: trust, respect, and the unwavering ability to deliver under pressure. They had told her to think about it, to decide if she was ready for the kind of commitment they were asking for. But for Emily, there was no question. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for her entire life. She had always known that the world wasn't kind to dreamers. It didn't care if you worked hard or if you had talent. The world only cared about results. And now she had to deliver. There was no room for failure. But how was she supposed to do that? Emily spent the next few days in a haze. She couldn't sleep, her mind constantly replaying every word from that meeting, dissecting every gesture, every look. What did they see in me, she wondered, pacing her apartment. What makes them think I can succeed when they've seen so many? Others fail. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Mr. Phillips. Mr. Phillips, I have a dinner with the investors next week. I need you to be ready. You'll be preparing a 5-course meal for them. This is your chance to prove yourself. Don't waste it. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. A 5-course meal? For them? Her stomach turned. She had never prepared a meal on that scale before, not even close. What if she failed? What if she couldn't deliver? The pressure of the task before her was almost unbearable, but there was no going back now. She had to rise to the occasion. The next few days were a blur of frantic preparation. Emily spent hours in the kitchen, experimenting with recipes, trying new techniques, pushing herself beyond what she had ever done before. She would stay up late, tasting, adjusting, rewriting her menu until it felt right. Each dish had to be perfect, each ingredient meticulously chosen, each flavor carefully balanced. Her phone constantly buzzed with updates from Mr. Phillips. He was meticulous, sending her reminders, offering tips, but also pushing her harder than she had ever been pushed before. Every message felt like a test, a measure of her commitment, her willingness to succeed at all costs. And then the day of the dinner arrived. Emily stood in her small kitchen, the weight of the world on her shoulders. Her hands were shaking as she prepared the ingredients for the first course. A delicate foie gras terrine, something that would require precision and patience to pull off. The clock on the wall seemed to tick louder with every passing second, and she could feel the tension building in her chest. This is it, she thought, staring at the ingredients in front of her. This is what it all comes down to. The dishes she had chosen for the meal were meant to reflect her skills, her creativity, and her ability to impress. A classic French dish to start, followed by a modern twist on an Italian favorite, a rich seafood course, and a decadent chocolate dessert to end the night. Each course was meant to showcase not just her technical ability, but her unique perspective on food. But as she started cooking, she began to realize just how much was riding on each moment. Each step she took, each decision she made, felt like it could determine her future. Would she succeed, or would she fall flat, just like so many before her? Hours passed, and Emily worked with the kind of focus she had never known. The kitchen was a whirlwind of activity, with pots bubbling, knives slicing, and pans sizzling. She moved with precision, her mind clear and sharp, despite the whirlwind of nerves churning inside her. Just as she was finishing the last course, her phone buzzed again. It was a message from Mr. Phillips. Mr. Phillips, I'm sending someone over to check on your progress. They'll be there in 20 minutes. Make sure everything is perfect. Emily's heart skipped a beat. Someone's coming? She had known it was coming. Mr. Phillips was relentless in his pursuit of excellence, and he was always looking for ways to make sure his investments were well spent. But she hadn't expected it to happen this soon. She quickly wiped her hands on her apron and went to the door, only to find a tall, imposing man standing on her doorstep. He was well-dressed, his eyes cold and calculating. I'm here to see the meal, he said, without any preamble, walking past her into the apartment without waiting for an invitation. Emily felt a wave of panic rise in her chest. Who was this man? Was he one of the investors? Or was he just someone sent to judge her abilities? Either way, she wasn't prepared for this kind of scrutiny. She led him to the kitchen, where the dishes were laid out in all their glory. The foie gras terrine, the lobster risotto, the seared tuna with truffle oil. It all looked perfect. Emily felt a slight wave of pride wash over her, but it was quickly replaced by dread. The man didn't say a word. He simply picked up a fork and began to taste each dish one by one. Emily watched him, her stomach in knots, trying to decipher his expression. Was he impressed or was he just being polite? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he set down his fork and turned to her. His face was unreadable. "Not bad," he said, his voice low, "but not good enough. The risotto is a bit too rich, the tuna lacks depth, and the foie gras, well, it's a bit underseasoned." Emily's heart sank. Underseasoned? She had worked so hard to get the balance just right. How could he say that? "I'll pass along the feedback," he continued, barely glancing at her as he turned to leave. "But don't get too comfortable. Mr. Phillips is watching you." With that, he was gone, leaving Emily standing in the middle of her kitchen, her confidence shattered. She had given everything to this meal. Everything, and yet it hadn't been enough. Her hands trembled as she cleaned up the kitchen, wiping away the remnants of the night. Was it really not good enough? She had poured her heart into this, and, still, it felt like it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. The feeling of inadequacy, of not being good enough, sank into her bones. Was this the life she wanted? Was this the price of success? Her phone buzzed again, but this time she didn't want to look. The weight of the world felt like it was crashing down on her. But she had no choice. The future was still waiting for her, whether she was ready or not. The days that followed the disastrous tasting were a blur of self-doubt and silent rage. Emily couldn't understand what had gone wrong. She had worked so hard, given so much. Her dreams, once so clear and vibrant, now seemed like a distant mirage, slipping further out of her grasp the more she tried to reach for them. The criticism stung, but it wasn't the critique that haunted her. It was the idea that perhaps she wasn't cut out for this world, the world of fine dining, of high-stakes expectations, of relentless pressure. It felt like she had been thrown into a storm without a life raft. The sinking realization gnawed at her, and the harder she tried to swim, the faster the current seemed to pull her under. Days turned into nights, and Emily found herself standing in front of her stove again, her hands trembling as she reheated the leftover risotto. She hadn't cooked anything new in days. She couldn't bring herself to. Each time she thought about creating something from scratch, the thought of failure crept in, reminding her of the cold indifference in the stranger's eyes as he tore apart her hard work. "Not good enough," she thought bitterly. "Everything I do just isn't enough." But deep down, Emily knew that she couldn't quit. She didn't have the luxury of surrender. She'd been given an opportunity, a door had opened for her, and there was no way she could turn back now. She glanced over at the phone on the counter, the one that had been buzzing non-stop with messages from Mr. Phillips. She had ignored them for the past few days, but now there was no more hiding. The message from Mr. Phillips read, "You're being given another chance. The dinner is in 3 days. This is your final opportunity. Don't fail me, Emily." The words were sharp, direct, almost like a warning. Emily swallowed hard. This was it. This was the make-or-break moment. No more excuses, no more second-guessing. She had to pull herself together, no matter how broken she felt inside. The next 3 days were a whirlwind of frantic preparation. Emily threw herself back into the kitchen, determined to prove that she was worthy of this chance, even if she didn't fully believe in herself. The thoughts of failure, of inadequacy, still lurked in the back of her mind. But this time, she pushed them aside. She meticulously planned out every dish, every ingredient. She worked for hours, sometimes forgetting to eat or sleep, so consumed by the pressure of perfection. Every dish had to be flawless. Every movement in the kitchen had to be deliberate. She couldn't afford any missteps this time. But no matter how hard she worked, there was always that nagging voice in the back of her mind, questioning whether she was good enough. It wasn't just the fear of the investors, of Mr. Phillips, but the fear of herself. She had come so far, but how could she really be a Michelin-level chef? How could someone like her, someone with nothing but raw talent and a dream, stand alongside the giants of the culinary world? In the quiet moments, when she was alone, the self-doubt would overwhelm her. She had never been trained in a prestigious kitchen. She hadn't had the luxury of mentorship from world-renowned chefs. She had just learned on her own, honing her skills through trial and error, working her way up from nothing. Was it enough? Was it enough to stand toe-to-toe with the best? Her phone buzzed again, snapping her out of her spiraling thoughts. It was a message from Mr. Phillips. "I expect nothing less than perfection. You know what this means? Don't fail." The words hit her like a punch. Perfection. Is that all they want? She thought. It felt like an impossible standard to reach. Perfection wasn't something she could just create in a kitchen. It was something intangible, fleeting, but she had to try. The evening of the dinner arrived, and the weight of expectation was almost unbearable. Emily stood in front of her stove, preparing the final touches, the last-minute adjustments to each dish. Her hands were clammy, her stomach twisted in knots. She couldn't afford any mistakes. She couldn't afford failure. The doorbell rang. Her heart skipped a beat. Mr. Phillips had arrived with the investors. She barely had a moment to collect herself before the knock on her kitchen door echoed through the apartment. "You're ready?" Mr. Phillips's voice was cold, businesslike as always. Emily nodded, forcing a smile. "Yes, everything's ready." The investors filed in, their eyes scanning the kitchen, noting every detail. The table was set, the wine chilled, and each dish was carefully plated and ready to be served. She could feel their scrutiny, like a weight pressing down on her shoulders. As they sat down at the table, Emily moved around them with a practiced grace, serving the dishes she had so carefully crafted. Each plate was an artwork in itself, a delicate balance of flavor and presentation, designed not only to satisfy the palate, but to tell a story. But as she watched them taste the first course, the weight of her anxiety seemed to pull her in 1,000 directions. What if they didn't like it? What if they saw through her act, through the smoke and mirrors she had carefully constructed? Mr. Phillips raised an eyebrow as he took a bite of the foie gras. The others followed suit, their expressions unreadable. Emily stood still, her breath held tight in her chest. Each bite they took felt like an eternity, each chew dragging on until it felt like a verdict was being delivered. Finally, Mr. Phillips spoke. "It's good," he said, nodding. "Better than last time." Emily exhaled in relief, but the doubt still lingered. Is it good enough? The night wore on, and Emily moved between the kitchen and the table, checking on the investors, refilling wine glasses, wiping away smudges from the plates. Every now and then, she would steal a glance at Mr. Phillips, who seemed more and more impressed as the night went on. But then, just as Emily was beginning to breathe easier, a voice broke through the silence. "This is good," one of the investors said, his voice low but full of intrigue. "But I think we've seen enough." The words landed like a hammer, and suddenly, all the progress Emily thought she had made seemed to disappear in an instant. They had barely begun the main course. Mr. Phillips looked at Emily, his gaze cold. "Why don't you explain your choices?" he said, his tone commanding. "What is it that sets you apart from every other chef we've seen?" The question hung in the air, heavy and loaded, and for the first time that night, Emily found herself lost for words. She had practiced everything, every dish, every movement. But this was beyond her control. This wasn't about the food. It was about her vision, about the woman behind the apron. She swallowed hard. She began, but the words seemed to catch in her throat. "I'm not just trying to cook food. I want to create experiences. I want my food to speak to people, to make them feel something. It's not just about technique. It's about emotion. It's about taking them on a journey." The table was silent for a moment, and Emily couldn't tell if her words had made any impact. She waited, her heart pounding in her chest, but then, to her surprise, Mr. Phillips spoke. "Not bad," he said. "Let's see how the next course goes." The evening ended without fanfare. The dishes had been enjoyed, but Emily still couldn't shake the feeling that she was being tested in ways she hadn't prepared for. As the investors left, she felt the weight of the night's events settle on her shoulders. Had I done enough? In the silence of the kitchen, she felt the burning question echo through her mind. What now? The end.